warm welcome to you all from Matrix team in the third edition of Techtonix series. I'm Debleena and I'm part of the human capital function at Matrix. Today, we deep dive into scaling engineering and maximizing productivity. I had been in multiple discussions with our portfolio founders, senior leaders at the firm, or even industry leaders to find out the what, why, or how behind building a successful technology organization. Some of the probably most asked questions around it is like what it takes, or how to bootstrap and set up, or probably how to scale, what is the right time, right culture, etc. So in that context, it's a gratifying experience for me to have Mr. Amod Malviya as our guest speaker today. Welcome, Amod. Though Amod needs no introduction at all, but a quick note on his achievements. As the CTO, he not only built and scaled Flipkart engineering, what we see today, he also built hundreds of entrepreneurs within his team. Udaan is another reflection of his thoughts towards engineering in India. So super excited to have you here. From Matrix end, I have Mr. Rajat Agarwal, Managing Director and Head of FinTech, Consumer Tech, and Health Tech Investments. Rajat has immense experience of technology-driven businesses like Razorpay, OneCard, Jupiter. It will be quite intriguing today to see how they two address the theme of productivity as an effective hiring hack. With that note, I'm opening the forum to you all. By the way, we intend to keep this discussion as most interactive, so please feel free to raise hand, ask questions at any point. Amod, over to you, sir.
All right, thanks, Deb. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm hoping the audience would be, the group that we are speaking to would be less kind given the kind of topic, and I'm sure Rajat would be provocative enough. So yeah, I wanted to start with, I want to start by making a claim that will likely make me lose whatever little respect I have in the community. That is the fact, my belief that most companies are actually overstaffed, particularly when it comes to technology. And it is an observation based out of my own experience, at different organizations. Having hired and grown technology teams of various sizes, as well as, based on my conversations with different entrepreneurs around the kind of issues that they face and the kind, different people obviously reach out for some or the other input. So based on all of those conversations, that's been my observation. So which is why when, you guys approached me for this forum, I thought that, this would be a good provocative topic to discuss about productivity as a way of actually solving hiring, or probably in some cases even a substitute to hiring. So yeah, I think, but to do that, I think we should try to define productivity. And through the course of this conversation, I'm hoping that a lot of those elements would emerge. But to me, it's certainly a lot more than just tools and processes. I think there's a deep cultural connotation to productivity about how we think about organization design. It pervades roles and responsibilities, ownership structures, model of working, how decisions get made, how different iterations to the execution actually happens. So it is a very pervasive thing. So productivity, because it's very often ends up getting used in a very transactional way. I want to be very clear that at least when I'm approaching this conversation today, I'm looking at it in a far more pervasive fashion and not just as a tool thing. My observation has also been that once we start looking at it in this way, it tends to have a very cascading effect on the rest of the organization. So it's not something that an engineering leader can make if they were to go down this path that I would be advocating in this discussion today. it's something that an organization will need to commit to if at all they end up doing something like this. It's not something that an engineering leader in isolation can actually solve for themselves. It has cascading effects for HR organizations, how they think about people, how they even think about role definitions in HR and the meaning of work there. It has implications for the TA function or the recruitment function. So yeah, I mean, that's what I had in mind. I'm sure that this group is a highly accomplished group. So I don't mean to be preaching to the choir. I want to be very clear about it. These are just my thoughts and my observations that I would be sharing. And my request would be to see this as a provocation for us as a group to be very deliberate about how we think about org design, than just incrementally building upon the traditional org design that we have been, receiving as wisdom. So yeah, so that's what I wanted to sort of make as an opening remark.
So thank you, Amod. Something very close to my heart as well. And interestingly, we have Deb, who leads human capital at Matrix, and her job is to find great talent for our portfolio. And at one end, we see this problem that all of us face, that people are just not, the founders are not able to find great people. At the other end, we are saying that most companies are overstaffed. So how does this dichotomy work, right? And why do you think these companies are overstaffed? What's the root cause for this?
What's the root cause for it? I think let me talk about symptoms first, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully root cause would sort of emerge from it. I think if you were to ask a typical engineer in your organization about, what did this last release solve for you, right? The piece that you had been working on, what exactly did it solve? You release the feature, 0 bugs or very few bugs, etc., and you moved on to the next feature. Based on my hiring experience, and I would have easily interviewed by now, I think close to definitely more than 1,500 to 2,000 people.
Yeah, I can
8 to 9 out of 10 people would actually not be able to answer that correctly. And this is the state in most organizations. Obviously, this is my experience. People's experiences can differ, but this has been my experience, which means that for a typical person in the organization, their ability to connect the work that they're doing with the end outcome is actually very, very poor. At best, what I see is the person who's actually owning the end outcome, if they are a particularly good person, they would end up sharing out and celebrating out that not just the launch of it, but actually we ended up meeting or beating the outcome that we had set for ourselves. So this is the first symptom, that in terms of how much relatability people have to the end outcome. Second is this whole conversation about thinking in terms of ratio of engineers to PMs or engineers to EMs, that sort of a thing. I think it has a basis in a very, I by no means I'm a researcher in org design, but whatever I understand is that from org design, a lot of org design has a military history, which then mapped onto factory sort of setups and that sort of thing. I don't think this model inherently is very well suited for creative setups, which is what tech companies should be, right? This structure works very well for ITES setups.
Yep, services
because you're a delivery organization, right? And yet we see most tech companies setting up the same organization structure that actually reflects and almost like an internal services or design than actually ownership towards the end outcome. The third symptom that I see is almost every CEO that I meet ends up talking about my tech team is slow. What do I need to do?
Yeah.
And actually, they don't even start with that. They almost always start with, I need to hire more. And then when you talk about it, then you realize that, hey, my tech team is slow. it doesn't even occur to most of us that the problem could be elsewhere. And we just keep on hiring. Then there are things like alignment of tech, product, business. You get into all of these almost artificial separations in our mind, which, and then we start applying these bandages of different processes, role definitions, etc. And every single such bandage actually takes people one step away from the end outcome, end ownership of the outcome. So what that effectively leads to is that you start hiring more, to solve for this notion of, that you're not able to get enough things done in a certain time frame. And the more you hire, that much more you need to rely on org structures of a certain military nature
to manage them and so on.
Yeah, so just it becomes a recursive cycle, and before you know, you are just a huge organization.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I know that I didn't answer your question directly, but just starting.
No, look, I think the symptoms are clear, right? And we are all struggling with it. And I was joking that at Matrix also we think about it a lot, right? That productivity is perhaps the biggest thing that we all could solve for. But tell me, Amod, people often say this in Bangalore, right? People just don't show up, right? There is this pervasive thing that people will come at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, take 5 breaks in between, go for gym in the evening, and 5 o'clock shut shop or 6 o'clock shut shop. It may not happen in smaller companies, but in larger companies, it's, people do talk about it.
Yeah.
So isn't this a, culture problem more so than anything else, that, it's just all around us? And how do you, especially for companies has say 30, 40, 50, 100 engineers, how do you change this?
Well, it absolutely is a culture problem, but I think, culture happens, right? It's not a problem in isolation. Culture becomes like this because of the fact that it's easy to hide in a crowd.
Yeah.
Right. So the moment you have a crowd, it becomes extremely difficult to actually, keep a tab on these things. It's very easy for mediocrity to hide in a crowd. So which is why so there are two ways we can approach this, Rajat, in this discussion. One is, in a large setup, how do you actually approach, solving for something like this? Or alternatively, which would be my preferred approach, that, how do you not find yourself in a large setup in the first place? Like I was not kidding when I say that most tech companies are actually overstaffed. We think that we need so many people, but in reality, so you'd not believe this, but when at Udaan, when we first became again, valuation is not really a good proxy, but I'm using that proxy as a way to define a certain scale at which we were operating at that time. When we were valued at $1 billion, we had 17 engineers, 17.
Wow.
Right? And the point was, that there is just a lot more that can be achieved so long as the following criteria are met. The first one being a certain degree of clarity, right? What I often see is that we as leaders, and I'm equally guilty of that enough number of times, we try to compensate for poor quality of thinking with a certain quantity of people that can get it done.
Yeah.
And that's usually the starting point. And that it shows up in the speed at which, the thoughts are changing. Now, I don't want to be misinterpreted here. Every thought evolves, okay? But very often, we as leaders end up using that as an excuse to not be very deliberate, very, thoughtful about how we arrive at conclusions about what needs to be done our insight about a particular market and all of these things. And when we try to compensate for it by, so the other extreme is, like another stereotype of a person is, I will generate insight by throwing 1,000 darts and some of them will actually stay. And who am I to judge which one of the two approaches actually works? But if you throw 1,000 darts, then you will need 1,000 people actually throwing one dart each, right?
But
So,
we know the second one's not working. We're all struggling. Right?
Yeah. So I think that's the starting point, that we as leaders, how thoughtful are we, right? Second is the nature of conversation that actually happens between us and our team. The more, again, 90% just, like all statistics are made out of thin air in this discussion. I want to be clear about it. 90% of the scenarios I see a conversation along the lines of build me this, build me that, right? You're not sharing a perspective about why, why we need to build something, or rather what problem we actually need to solve. The problem that happens in this sort of a communication is that the picture that we have in our head is always looks far richer, far more beautiful than what it actually is in reality when you are communicating. And that gap is only understood by the person at the other end. It's almost never understood by the CEO or whoever it is that is actually coming up with the idea. Instead of that, if you were to actually flip it around and say that, I've been having observations about this pain point in the market. Come along with me. Let's actually, study this problem together. Okay. There's a lot of unsaid things that end up being absorbed in the psyche of the person who's eventually supposed to be solving that problem. If you don't do that, every single time you'll have to be particularly verbose, isn't it? There is no other way than to actually be particularly verbose. Yeah. So how do organizations end up solving for that verbosity? I will hire a product manager. Because my engineer doesn't understand the problem. So, I'll have this product manager who will act as a go-between, the person who has the idea. And there are these code monkeys who do not understand anything about business, who do not understand anything about solving problems. So I'll have this product manager who will understand the problem after, instructions from me. It's called stakeholder management. They would end up, the product manager would then translate that in a language that the code monkeys understand, and so be it. So, if you have that sort of a communication model, there is no way around having 1,000 code monkeys. Okay. Yeah. And that is the problem, because software is a living being. It is not a static thing, fire and forget thing. What tends to happen is software design, there's a lot of intricacies which determine how much change and what kind of change you would actually be able to do based on the choices that you make today. So the decision that you're making today will show up in your speed of execution 9 months later, 12 months later. Okay. If the person does not understand the unsaid context, their decision making around it is going to be very, very poor. And this is what actually happens uniformly. Okay. You will have one day CEO is supremely frustrated and comes in and says, what, my tech team does not really solve the problem. But the CEO does not really understand that, there were certain choices that were made. I'll give you an example. Let's say for e-commerce, because that's a domain that I understand to a certain degree. In e-commerce, depending upon whether you're solving for a third-party marketplace or a first-party setup, your code base would look completely different. Okay, I'm trivializing this point a little, but just using it to very clearly highlight the problem. So if one day you as an organization decide that I'm actually going to become, like from here to there or here to there, from the mind of a person who doesn't really understand how technology companies work, that person would be like, itna chota sa hi to change hai, it's like you just need to show this thing here, right? And the engineer is sitting there thinking, ki, yaar, matlab, it's not as simple as that. Yes, I can put an if else here, but what about that other place where, it is not yet, you're not considering that scenario, right? Things become very complicated very quickly. And the only way the only way I've understood to actually minimize the risk of it is by exposing the builders to context.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, in the absence of that kind of context, you will have armies of people.
But then don't you need a different quality of builders? Or
Absolutely, you do. But here's the thing, because we talk often about this 10x engineer thing, right? Some people have also burned their hands, I think, by tweeting about it. There's a lot of people who have very strong opinions about this. But at the risk of ostracizing myself, I will claim that the notion of 10x engineer exists. I think what you're really looking for is very high quality people, okay, who can make decisions. So like, they may not be 100% able to make every kind of decision, but they have made decisions in the past, and they can, using some contextual help from the rest of the people in the organization, they can arrive at the right sort of picture. The number of such people is very less, and in the industry we know them as product engineers, but that number is growing pretty fast. The point is, if you end up going down the path, you really don't need 1,000 of these. You probably need only 25 of these, and these 25 of these can move mountains for you, right?
No, Amod, don't disagree at all, but where do you get these people, right? And like, so one is, where do you get them? Second, not every company has the wherewithal to attract them, no? Because these engineers would want to work at the next Flipkart or the next Udaan with leaders like you, who are, accomplished CTOs. Why would a 10x engineer go work for a seed company where,
So there are two ways you can think about it, okay? And it's not like, I disagree with you on this. I actually completely understand where you're coming from. And I'll also pick one example from one of my pre-Flipkart days, because startups were not as sexy at that time. And we didn't have enough money to hire, the very best engineers. But there are two ways we can actually think about it. One is throw money at the problem, because you're hiring much lesser people. Once you nail down a person, do not let that person go for any cost, right? But nailing down that person is very tricky, because you've got to orient your hiring process to really, really evaluate that orientation very strongly. One of the ways that I used to joke with our early engineers at Udaan was, if I have to hire 5 times or 10 times the number of engineers that I'm currently having in mind, remember that your increment is going to drop by that much. So there's your motivation to actually sort of, do more. But jokes aside, so the first one is throw money at the problem, if you can. You would still end up saving cost eventually, even if you are bothered about that. The second approach is, if you do not have sufficient money at the problem, you will have, without doubt, you will have to work harder to figure out that kind of person. Here's the interesting thing, Rajat. In my observation, people who are at, मान लेते हैं, a Flipkart, but were not involved in the formative years of Flipkart, may not necessarily actually be, again, friends would be very angry with me on my, I don't mean to sort of, piss anybody off.
No, but exceptions will exist, I'm sure.
Yeah. But my point is, what you're looking for is people who've been involved in the formative years of any company, be it successful or not successful, right? Once you narrow down on those set of people, there would be a fairly large chunk of it who were not involved in decision making. But at least you have a higher chance of finding that needle in the haystack if you were to narrow it down like that. And this is what I actually used to rely on, pre-Flipkart days ke time pe. Plenty of failed startups us समय पे होती थी. So, I used to rely on that. Worst case scenario is worst case scenario, you need to hire a superstar, select CEO or a person who can then attract. So you pump all of your money into that one person. Pump that person with all the equity that you can, and then have this person attract the right kind of talent. So
got it. So a quick question to the audience. Please feel free to ask, guys. We want to make this a very open forum. So just type in your questions in the Q&A box, or otherwise just let us know. You can bring that.
Yeah, a small addition there, just to add on to what Rajat said. I am a strongly opinionated person, but please feel completely free to tell me, Amod, what you are saying. This is how I can tell you that in practice cannot happen. Okay, so please feel completely free to contest anything that I'm saying. That's perfectly fine as well.
Interesting.
So, go ahead, Deb.
So I think our first question is from one of the CTO co-founder itself, and it is more towards productivity, right? So Amod, you were saying about how to nail down, let's say I remember the Udaan days, the core team you had in Udaan, like they are your believers, right? No matter whatever product you make after Flipkart, whether it is Udaan, whether it is XYZ, you have made them believe that this is the next product where you should be in.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, that is a motivating factor to drive their productivity as well. Apart from other monetary things, whatever you said, right? So how you ensure that productivity is the question, right? And how do you measure it? So
sure. Good. You want to sort of elaborate?
No. It is like that. How firstly you just box out the productivity as a definition for them, and then incrementally how you measure it when your company is going in different stages.
Sure, fair enough. So I think there is no one single answer to the productivity piece. It's a multidimensional problem. So obviously there's no one single answer. But I'm going to lay down a bunch of proxies that have been helpful for me. I think the first and foremost thing is for the leader to introspect at a certain frequency. Let that frequency be, for example, a quarter. Okay. So as a leader, you would introspect the kind of meaningful outputs. The key here is meaningful outputs. It's not just kitna kaam hua. It's about meaningful output, things that actually ended up creating impact. In the last quarter, out of the number of things where we were able to put meaningful things out, what percentage of my team was actually involved in it? So that is one of the questions I would actually introspect, and this is one of the proxies that I personally tend to use. Another thing is for decision making. How much coordination is needed for operational decision making, right? For example, if you're working on, taking an e-commerce example, if you're working on a pricing algorithm, okay, does it require a meeting between 4 or 5 different people to actually make a think about how to get something done? Or is this something that an engineer thought of and understood the context and can just act? Or maybe just having 2 people involved or something like that. So the number of decisions or the percentage of your roadmap requiring coordination between different groups, different people, that points to a productivity problem. The third would be how much time people are actually spending. I'm using this third point only because it's just so commonly present. I often ask people, what percentage of time did you spend not on the problem that you own? Okay, it could be stakeholder management, it could be asking for permission, it could be running behind legal, It could be just because your laptop didn't come in time. It could be as silly as that to as complicated as, I'm waiting for approval from from the CEO. Okay. So yeah, I think all of these pieces are actually, these are the proxies that I use. So no direct answer, I'm sorry, but these are the things that I did.
Amod, picking up another one. So on this 10x engineer point, so one is obviously early startups you could pick from, but there's a question: can you train people, or can you make these people 10x, either freshers or existing guys, or you have to
That's
just?
a very good question, actually. That's a very good question. I believe that the answer is yes. A lot of people would disagree with me. I can also, I can tell you that as well. I think two scenarios exist. Scenario one may the person naturally is oriented, to think about problem in a richer way and to not hesitate. Such a person does not look at technologies as I'm a Java engineer or this sort of a thing. This person looks at technology as a way to actually, solve a problem. Technology as a tool sort of a thing. The engineering is here, right? The engineering is not in the tool the engineering is here. So some people naturally have that orientation and they can be cultivated. Definitely, they are actually fairly self-driven people as well. So the amount of help they need from you is actually quite limited. I have also seen that sufficient number of times, but so long as you have a critical mass of people like this, even if you hire the other kind of people who are not naturally oriented like that, enough of people would actually migrate over to this behavior. So in that sense, you can inspire people to actually, strive for something richer than what they are naturally attuned to do. But yes, there would be a, definitely more than 70% of that set would get discarded eventually.
So
yeah.
Amod, what are 2 or 3 things that you would look for in an engineer to tell you very clearly, boss, this is a 10x engineer?
I think the taking a problem, taking ownership of a problem, taking things to conclusion. So understanding the problem, taking things to conclusion. So engineers who naturally articulate things in terms of not just deployment, I ended up putting out this feature, but talking in terms of what that feature was actually intended to do, and working backwards from it. What we launched this is what didn't work, so we actually ended up making a change here and that, those sort of things. So people who talk about that end problem sort of a vocabulary, who use that vocabulary to describe their past work, I think that's a very good proxy. Yeah, I think that's the best proxy actually. So yeah.
Got it. We'll come to this other question. There's a specific one on full stack developers. We'll come to that. But Amod, like on this call, at least bunch of folks have already started companies, right? And they will have some existing teams. What if I don't have any of these people today, right? What do you do then? Did you do a complete, brain surgery, or what do you do?
So Rajat, I think that's a very good question. See, I would be dishonest if I were to say that I have an answer to this, because to be honest, I have never done it, so I can only speculate or guess. With that caveat, any sudden change would certainly be a problem. I think what Rajat has gone through a power loss, I can see that.
Yeah, he's stuck. But you continue. He will join back. No worries.
Yeah. So I think if I were in your place where this sort of a scenario exists, I would first and foremost identify, is there any number of people internally who have that orientation, who actually work like that, think like that. And I start changing my working model with these people at least, to reflect that ownership orientation, that I'm going to expose you to the problem, you understand and take ownership, and I want you to take things to logical conclusion completely on your own, I start changing that model of working with them. While with the other people, I continue to run whatever existing working model is there. So long as some of these people shine through, I think that will act as an orientation for the others to sort of strive towards. If at all you don't have any such person in your company, the only way to is to actually start bringing in some of this talent, and then start this sort of migration journey, so to say. If I were to take a guess, I think a period of 1 to 1.5 years should be sufficient to actually do this change.
Understood. So in that line, two interesting questions from the audience. So as you said, that if there is somebody within the team, you nurture them, you grow them, right? But when you have to hire from outside, right? What are your parameters, or what you take into purview to decide when that is the right time to do and when you should stop? That is
Do you mean like when should I do what? Hire?
Yes, when you hire from outside, let's say you
Okay,
don't,
when should we hire? Right?
and when you stop increasing that team and decide that, okay, I have sufficient number of.
That's actually yeah, yet again this is a good question. I think a natural corollary from what I had already been talking about, that you think in terms of people as problem owners, sort of a thing. The question about when do you hire more is when your problem space expands. Right? If your problem space is not expanding, the first thing to do is actually to look inwards. Why is my existing team not able to deliver on what what the organization needs? But if the problem space is expanding, definitely hire. If the problem space is not expanding, first introspect, and if you end up concluding that I've exhausted all productivity bottlenecks internally, then you obviously consider hiring from the outside. When to stop hiring? I think that's a bit of a moot question, is what I would say, because you're only hiring with a certain anticipation of a certain expansion of problem space, X number of new problems getting created, or I'm subdividing a problem, I'm dividing a problem into sub-problems. The kind of ownership areas they create, I will hire for them, and nothing more than that. So this notion of stopping hiring, starting hiring, stopping hiring, we need to think from a product company's perspective, not from an ITES perspective. ITES company ka hota hai ki bhar lo, sorry, I get into Hindi every time, but you sort of let's hire a few dozen engineers, we'll find projects for them, right? It's almost criminally bad for a product company leader to actually think like that. And yet we see this as I don't mean to be insulting if any of you have done that. I've done that mistake in the past, so I'm just sharing my own sort of mistakes here. Yeah.
Amod, any best practices on how to manage the coordination between business and tech to achieve this?
So I think the starting point, Rajat, has to be that we as much as possible, we try not to look at them as, we don't try to create artificial boundaries between them, right? It's not like I do not recognize the nature of work and the difference in nature of work that actually happens between them. But here is what I mean by that. In technology, we have this concept of control plane, data plane, right? Control plane is jahan par ki, you are creating your algorithms, creating your products, sort of a thing. And data plane is on a day-to-day basis, as per what you have, how things are actually working, right? Say, for example, you are a SaaS company. Your control plane is where your roadmaps get created and those sort of things. Your data plane is the daily sales calls, X number of, sort of lead gen activity that is happening, etc. What you would want is that the set of people in your business function who have the capacity to operate in the control plane. These are people who are not getting into a demand and produce sort of a equation with the tech team. Okay, that hey, I need this, and this team says yes, sir, ho jayega. Okay, some enthusiastic EM puts their hands up and says yes, ho jayega. But instead of that, you are actually relying on you treat this control plane group, no matter whether it's an engineer or a business person or a product manager. I'll tell you what, at Udaan I was actually quite there are a few people who have a history of actually being on the ground sort of sales oriented, and they would come up with such brilliant thoughts, brilliant insights. Okay, the change where some degree of, I would say, some degree of coaching that was actually needed was to get them to share the insight more and not their view of the solution. Okay, once the insight is deeply understood, then the person who's actually owning that problem would be able to do a much better job of it. And then they can actually own the end outcome because they've understood the problem deeply. Then they can really own the end outcome. Otherwise, they would not be able to. They would just be, "Tumne mujhe jo bola karne ke liye, I ended up doing it. Now why are you blaming me, boss?" Sort of, right? You don't want that equation. So that's the first thing, that you identify those people in your business who have the capacity to work with a product team effectively. They need to show these traits. They need to think in a control plane model. They need to think not in a delivery-oriented model. They need to think in a product-oriented model. And you need people in tech to actually be having that routine. So that's the first step. The second step is for that data plane feedback, because a lot of things are happening on a data. Just like e-commerce, there's a supply chain. So you supply chain, say for example, somebody ended up putting out certain algorithm for the way shipments are scheduled between different pin codes. Within a pin code, they are scheduled. They end up putting it out and then ended up forgetting about it. And 6 months later, there is some change that is actually happening. Things have a way of evolving inside an organization. If nobody is keeping an eye on it, what tends to happen is on the floor, the data plane mein jo movement ho raha hai, things will take a life of their own. If there is nobody who's actually keeping an eye on this problem, thinking it's a done deal, this will degenerate. So what I mean is, data planes and control plane, there's a feedback cycle that actually needs to be good. And the best way to do that, Rajat, in my experience, has been the best way that works for me is having an institutionalized model of listening to customer. And in our case, it was field visit. So we had an institutionalized model of field visit. Once every 4 weeks, as Team Expanded, we've made it once every 6 weeks. You have to be on the field. 2 days in the month, you have to be on the field. You have to be talking to people, getting the gullies directly from the customer, hearing the happiness if you ended up solving a problem for them. And what I did was I made HR responsible for the efficacy of this program. Okay, right. And this, by the way, is one of the examples of what I meant by that. If you orient your organization like this, functions like HR can truly become knowledge functions than just a people process sort of a function. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the ways that I found useful. I'm sure that people in this group can come up with much better ways as well.
Rajat, we have somebody in the audience who raised hand, Vinay. So I'm just allowing him to talk, right?
Please.
Probably he can ask the question directly. Vinay.
Thanks, Debleena. Hey, Amod. Hey, Rajat. I wanted to share a couple of perspectives and, wanted to hear your reactions to it, Amod. On productivity, one thought I had when you're talking about control plane, data plane is, the notion of doing functional domain modeling for your business and then keeping it up to date, right? So, and then trying to avoid Conway's law creeping in, right? Basically, be nimble with the org structure such that your functional domain model is what your team structures are defined for, rather than it becoming the other way around. That was one thought. The other is about tooling, right? So a lot of you spoke about laptops, but more than that, your build, you're basically your CI/CD pipeline, your developer core loop of writing code, testing it, deploying it, not investing in enough in that, resulting in productivity loss. These are the two thoughts I wanted to share.
No, absolutely. And thanks a lot for sharing this, Vinay. I fully agree with both points. And not talking about the second point in particular is in no way to sort of take away from the importance of it. It's just that something that is easily solvable just within the tech team alone, and which is the only reason why I didn't talk about it. That's something I would say is in direct control of most tech teams. Whereas some of the other points that I made also requires some of the non-tech part of the organization to fully comprehend and align as well. So which is why I was focusing on those. But that in no way brings down the importance of what you said.
Okay, anyone else from the audience? There's one question from Vishal from Loadshare. How do we help 10x engineers grow at a sustainable pace? And how do we avoid promoting to the level of incompetence?
So there are different connotations to this sustainable pace thing. Can I request if Vishal can sort of elaborate on the exact color to that point?
Deb, can you enable him to speak as well?
Yes, I did.
Hi, Amod. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So this was more around, like as 10x engineers, you end up supporting them, nurturing them a lot, right? And then the expectation that they have is also to be engaged and we keep giving them more complex problems to solve for, right? But then at a point of time, that will plateau. How do you keep them engaged for a long term?
Okay. I think pretty interesting question, Vishal. Initially, I misread this as how do we prevent burning out of 10x people? The person who's sort of making things work, we tend to sort of overload those people. So I don't have a clear answer to it. I can share something that partially addresses it. And the fact that I personally have not run into this problem of promoting to the level of incompetence as frequently probably tells me that this solution probably has some positive effect of this. I do not tend to make people jump around on problem statements a lot. I tend to tell people that once you've been assigned a certain problem statement, you are the owner of that problem statement for at least a year and a half, typically 2 years. So unless I end up dissolving that problem statement, you cannot prematurely move out of it. It tends to have some good effects and some bad effects, which I'll come to. The good effect is it forces people to sort of ruminate on the problem again and again, and develop a certain amount of domain expertise. You cannot have ownership of problem without developing domain expertise, correct? Because otherwise your decisions are actually going to be wrong more often than not. And the second good thing that tends to happen is that people don't tend to find themselves burning out as frequently, so long as the pace of execution is something that is reasonable. I think they don't tend to find themselves burnt out. The negative part of it, they can get bored, and this is something that I actually see fairly often. And one of the common themes in my conversations with such people is that it is not the problem statement that actually defines what you end up, the glory that you get. It is what you do with that problem statement that often, and more often than not, ends up actually defining that. More often than not, I see people eventually understanding it. So yeah, I mean, that's the practice that typically tends to work for me. And about the point about not promoting to the level of incompetence, because you defined the notion of promotion as more complex problem, I am assuming that it automatically gets solved in it. I have my own radical point of views about promotion hona chahiye, nahi hona chahiye, but that's a separate matter. Will not.
नहीं होना चाहिए.
Huh?
नहीं होना चाहिए.
He believes in democracy. All will be in same level.
Don't sort of throw labels, Deb, that tend to
Yeah,
evoke strong
just
opinions.
trying to make the mood a little lighter. I have a question actually lingering for some time, and that was posted here. See, so the question is that initial days of a startup journey, generally the leaders, they tend to hire the folks who are jack of all trades and also master of some, right?
Yeah.
In that way, it is coming to the full stack in technology. But the more you grow, your focus shift to the specialist stage wise, right? And you turn to make the decisions of what to give to whom based on their skill set. So how do you define that? Is it possible as pre-series A or series A company, they are working with a full stack engineer right now, building their product, take it to the market and make it live? When they are in series C, will they still rely on that same person with the total capability, or they will dissect his responsibilities and bring different talent?
Yeah, I think based on the stage of the company, generalist versus specialist, it's obviously a spectrum. I'll share my thoughts, but I recognize that it's something that quite often I find even people in my own team disagreeing with me very strongly on this. So take this with a pinch of salt. Personally, I feel that except for a very few rare scenarios, generalists work always. Okay, and there's a reason for it. See, abhi say 20 years back, 30 years back, when open source, the nature of open source was far too limited, you needed to be specialist far more, because every single thing that you deploy, like 90%, more than 90% of the code base that you deployed actually had to be built in-house, right? You needed to be a database expert because just things were so costly in terms of disk access and stuff like that. Whereas today, my guess is, I throw this number quite often, my guess is less than 7% of the deployed code base is actually built in-house, right? And the rest of the 93% is actually the highest quality software coming from the largest of companies out there. This is a gold mine for generalists. The reason why, how do we define generalists? Generalist does not mean that this person does not have the capacity to go deep. It's just that this person has sufficient understanding of technology space that on a need basis, they can deep dive in whatever thing that is actually needed.
Of course.
Okay, so I personally feel that that's the kind of people I personally love to work with, and I definitely have met a lot of such people. You need to definitely be able to retain such people. It requires special sort of orientation to keep these people motivated, but that's how I would personally prefer. But I think more than being dogmatic about it, I also want to be clear that you should do what you feel is right for your company at a certain point in time. So if you feel that immediately after Series A, you want a very deeply specializing iOS engineer, I can definitely see scenarios where that would be true. So hire that engineer. Okay. But whatever I'm sharing is from a vast majority perspective thing.
Sure. For the interest of the time, I think we have one more question to go.
Maybe. Okay, go ahead.
Rajat, you want to take it up?
Go ahead. I think the top 3 problems we've spoken about. John's question, let's address.
Right. Go ahead with that.
Are we right about believing that motivated engineers who can take product ownership cannot be nurtured in a remote first setup? Actually, very interesting question. Amod, so your thoughts on remote work, whether it's working, not working?
Yes.
And especially, go ahead. Yeah, I'll add.
Go ahead, complete it.
No, and look, remote is a reality, at least for some organizations. And how do you really make productivity 10x in a remote setup?
Yeah, I think a very hotly debated question in our ecosystem.
Indeed.
I would put a broad remark and then I'll sort of share my own views about it. The broad remark is, currently in our setup, more than something to do with the model of remote work itself, what determines whether it is working for an organization or not is the organization, typically the CEO. Okay. If the CEO does not believe in something, it will not happen. End of story. It will not happen. Okay. The reason why I'm saying this is both models have, and now I'm coming to my own point of view on this, both models have something going for them. Okay. It's important to understand the kind of culture that is needed in remote work versus the kind of culture that is possible to create in on-premises setup. Things that require serendipity, a lot of communication, and probably impromptu communication. Those are the sort of things that actually work very well in on-premises setup. For remote work to work effectively in a company, I definitely feel that productivity can shoot up significantly if it is done right, but it requires that orientation. Orientation being, you cannot rely on tap on the shoulder approach. Okay, you cannot tap on the shoulder. Remote work equivalent would be Slack pe message dal diye, WhatsApp, Signal, whatever it is, pe message dal diye. That cannot work. You need to rely on a little more rigorous upfront thinking. You need to be mindful of people's time, and you need to formulate your thought in a written sort of a fashion. Very recently, there was this Twitter page, we were exchanging notes about the notion of internal RFCs. Okay, request for comment. Just say internet ecosystem, we have RFCs ka concept to sort of collate things. If you have that culture, remote work can actually happen. Personally, for me, I'll tell you, in what way I was sort of deciding what should be remote and what should not be remote. Product engineering I had kept on premises. Okay, and a big reason for that was because the set of communication and exposure that was needed, I was finding it hard to actually imagine that as a permanent remote thing. Software engineering, on the other hand, which is a distinct setup that we had, where the nature of problem statement was not end user focused, but something purely technical. Just say cost of infrastructure needs to be within these bounds, etc. Or we need to have very low CI/CD turnaround time. What I think Vinay was mentioning earlier. These sort of problems ke liye, you don't need to be on premises. You can actually, because ambiguity to the problem, if it is lesser, remote works that much better, is what I ended up discovering. If the ambiguity requires, if resolution of ambiguity requires you to be coordinating that much more, on premises tends to actually be better. That is how personally I've tended to bifurcate these two things.
I have a very extreme view on this. I don't think this remote thing works.
In that note, Rajat,
how much of your work, Rajat, is about talking? You know, that should tell you why you hold the opinion that you do.
Yeah. No, so I think part of it is probably that, but I think driving self-motivation is a huge challenge in India, and it's something which is like 100% remote. While one of my best companies in my portfolio is actually 100% remote, they are somehow managing it, but I think. Something in the middle, right? With 3-4 days at least in office, or 2-3 days in office, and some time away could perhaps work. But I think I need to see my team.
That is becoming the pain point for us to hire, right? In the war of talent, especially tech. Everybody wants remote work.
Everybody. Actually, but जो रजत का जो point था ना, I think that's something worth pondering over. If people's individual self-drive is not high, abuse of remote work is definitely going to be very, very high.
Agree.
So if you have a large team, hiding in a crowd is easy. Hiding in a remote work crowd, even easier, right? So I think for remote work to be effective, I personally feel it definitely needs to be very strongly individual-oriented setup. It cannot be your traditional managerial sort of a setup. It will definitely not work because the self-drive pay reliance is very high for remote work to work.
True.
Okay, can we take Amod? I know we're out of time. Can you take Pramod's last question? Is some of the product engineers relish working with a fair bit of process-free environments? How do we manage this when the org becomes bigger?
I am not seeing that question. Can you?
So it is, product engineers typically relish working in process-free environments. But as the org grows and other leaders come in, they bring in methodologies and processes that may be off-putting for early-stage engineers.
Oh yeah, this is actually this is a good point. I've seen this as well directly. I can share certain. I don't have a ready-made answer for it. I can only share what attempts I have personally made about some of these, and we are yet to see whether to what degree they end up helping. I think product engineers as problem owners of the end user kind. As the organization grows, there are two ways organization can grow, right? One is horizontally, as the number of problems are increasing, in which case you don't have to bother as much because problems tend to be reasonably self-contained anyway. But if you're just hiring more blindly, then it definitely is a problem. And anyway, bulk of our conversation was about how you should first try to make sure that your internal model of productivity is fixed before you expand, just like your P&L is fixed before you start your growth acts, right? In this case, in our case, we first started off with product engineer. We realized that there were certain pure software kind of problems that also needed to be addressed. So we actually brought in software engineer. We then later on realized that not all changes that are happening require as deep of a product context, and we need almost pure programming hands. So we actually added a third kind of a role called application developer, where you bring in people with only a programming orientation. They don't need to have all of the ambiguity resolution capabilities of a product engineer. They don't necessarily need to have all the architectural capabilities of a software engineer, but they need to be highly reliable when it comes to programming, right? So when you are expanding like this, if at all you have a need to expand like this and you're expanding like this, what happens is that your product engineers continue to be few but highly capable. They become empowered. What you're really doing is you're adding to the capabilities of a product engineer without necessarily burdening them with this notion of a team. Okay, it has a lot more nuance to this than what I can share. But if you're interested in this, there's a guy called Kaushik Mukherjee, who at Udaan, he was with me at Flipkart as well. He's the person who was the architect of this notion of application developer, etc. And you guys should probably just ping him. Don't tell him that I I suggested because he's also a very busy person. I don't want him thinking that.
I'm pretty much in touch with Kaushik, sir.
Yeah, so you can try.
Super. Thank you so much, Amod sir, and all the audience folks in the audience. Thank you. Friday night, you all spent a good hour with us. So really appreciate you doing this. I hope this was useful, super helpful for me at least personally. So thank you, Amod, for doing this, and Deb, thank you so much for organizing and bringing us all together.
It was a pleasure to be here, Rajat. Thank you so much, and thank you, Debleena. Beyond this, if any of you end up feeling a need to debate or just chat up on this, just drop me a note. I'm always available to whatever degree I can.
Lovely. Thank you, everyone, and especially Rajat and Amod to spend this long time and answering every questions, right? Very patiently. Everyone have a great weekend, and we will see you in the next series of Techtonix.